very much for doing this.
Of course.
So basically, I'll just give you a quick rundown about the project. I'm talking to leaders and visionaries from the worlds of science, politics, religion, philosophy, and basically asking them all very similar questions, and I'm contrasting the answers. So that people can kind of get a clear perspective of where these different archetypical viewpoints of life, how they see the world and how they see our future and our consciousness. And
sounds good.
so the first question I ask everybody is, how would you describe the present state of the world today?
Well, it's sort of very mixed up. On one hand, there are, of course, huge problems that, in my view, more or less single-handedly created our lopsided worldview that has shifted much more towards scientific materialism, this idea that matter and matter's movement is everything of reality. And the religious worldview that was comparing it in the modernist times, which lasted roughly until about 1950, it is now having a very tough time dealing with this rise of scientific materialism. I think almost everywhere the religious worldview is retreating, and also the new worldview that quantum physics offers us, for reasons that we can go into if you want to, but two details to say immediately. Quantum worldview is having also a tough time to let it be known. We have known how to do it, how to integrate this to worldview since 1990, but we haven't had much success yet getting through to the public enough to create an environment in which the scientists have to give way and the religionists likewise have to give way and accept the integration. So I would say very mixed up. The hope, optimism, plenty of reason for it, because indeed we are gaining traction. And indeed, there probably are about 5 million people who are already very much aware of quantum physics, quantum worldview, quantum activism. So indeed, there is hope.
I would definitely like to get more into detail about that as we go into this. But it seems to me that from talking to leaders from science and politics and religion and spiritual practices, there is quite a division. They're all quite isolated in how they view the world. And they're somewhat skeptical of each other's perspective, where it seems like what you're suggesting is that we have to become more well-rounded as beings. I mean, you're obviously into science, but you're obviously into a more abstract understanding of life.
Well, my view is this, that this is not uncommon. Whenever a paradigm shift takes place, indeed, people have different views, and people feel a little competitive, because after all, we have grown up with, especially the intelligentsia, has grown up with scientific materialism, so bound to be influenced by the scientific materialist views, whether we are consciously aware of it or not. I find that the competition that you described, that my idea or no idea, is a bit surprising, because I expect people to work on themselves enough to become appreciative of other ideas. I'll give an example of such a person that I met, Irving Laszlo, who is very tolerant and wonderful person, just as I think I am very tolerant and quite appreciative of other people's work. Irving is, and I'll just give you a very brief example. I met him just last year at a conference in Mexico, and he always has held to a holistic view, but he knows quantum physics enough and understands it enough to introduce the concept of Akashic field as the domain of potentiality. I think he was the first one to introduce that clearly, that there is a Akashic causal field which must be responsible for non-local communication that a space experiment in quantum physics proves. So, but he never really publicly acknowledged until very recently, until he met me, that we can go further and identify Akashic field as consciousness itself. That requires quantum measurement theory, the way that I have done it, and Henry Stapp is the closest to do it that way, Casey Blood also. So I was very, very pleased with that approach, that he immediately saw the cogency that, okay, this is one step further. This is how paradigms improve and enlarge, by people conceding that, okay, we have been doing right, but this is even further. For example, holists now should all recognize that, look, the quantum view is also holist. It brings actually power to the holism philosophy. To hold on to holism of the old kind, like systems theory, Fritjof Capra does, is narrowness. It's saying, okay, my way or no way. Rupert Sheldrake, unfortunately, does the same thing. He has the idea of morphogenetic field. I have adapted to it completely with quantum physics, and I always praise Rupert as one of the great avant-gardes of new thinking. But to my little bit of dismay, I like him personally. He's a great man, and indeed very, very kind and generous and everything. But in his writings, he holds on to the idea that morphogenetic field is everything, in spite of the fact that he knows all these spiritual traditions. This idea of consciousness as the ground of being goes back to 3,000 years, to philosophers like Plato, the writers of Upanishad in India. Entire Buddhist philosophy is based on that. Even esoteric Christianity, in Jesus' writings, you can see echoes of this same idea, like kingdom of God is everywhere, that kind of statement that Jesus made, or even my father and I are one, which I have properly interpreted, and a few others have also properly interpreted. So what I'm saying is that the narrowness could be avoided perhaps if we had more meetings among the people, like Irving and I were able to talk together with each other. We had a lot of time together at that conference. So if we had that opportunity, now this is where we lack. Our conferences, consciousness conferences, depend so crucially on popular audience.
Right.
We never have any conferences, at least I participated in only one such conference among experts, no, two in the last few years. So very few opportunity of having a conference which will be funded by someone, which will only pay the people who are experts to talk to each other.
Right.
In both of those conferences, I tell you, it just filled my heart, because we could listen to each other, and although there was differences, and although nobody considered any ground, but everybody considered the idea that, okay, your ideas are relevant, it's good. We're just not sure if that's the only way.
Right.
That kind of tolerance. This is what we need, and that's how paradigms progress.
Right.
But you are right, this division among us experts is definitely one of the big deterrents to a quick integration of the parallel and competing polarized worldviews.
So let's go into a bit about the seeds of consciousness. Would you say that we are an innately conflicted species? Is quantum science all about polarity, and is that what we represent in our inner conflict? Is it something that we have to go through to reach levels of consciousness?
Quantum physics says clearly how to incorporate all the levels of consciousness where this polarization is produced. The polarization depends on how far down the rabbit hole of understanding you want to go. Unless you come to quantum physics, you don't get ideas such as non-locality or discontinuity, which clearly tells you that there is another realm of being. You see? The other realm of being is what the fundamental difference is between the religious spiritual worldview and scientific materialism. Scientific materialism, Newtonian physics insists that there is only space-time, matter moving in space-time. In that reality, there is no scope of validating our other experiences, such as even feelings,
right,
even thinking in terms of thinking meaning. Thinking as a syntactical thinking can be accommodated with computer thinking. But meaning thinking, computers cannot do. So in scientific materialism, basically there is no scope for feeling, meaning, and spiritual values. So those being excluded, how can you even possibly even try to include? This is what psychologists fail to understand, that their inability to recognize the chasm with science being based on such deep questions of the ability to tackle. Scientists just don't have the ability to tackle higher experiences, and psychologists, unless they incorporate physiology, which they can't, have no way to incorporate the material part of reality. So in effect, each group of religions ignore the material, materialists ignore the higher experiences. This is the reason for polarization. Quantum physics gives you a way of making a science of all experiences. This is the integrative power of quantum physics. But for that, you need added assumptions, no question. And these added assumptions that I have made are not based on imagination. They're based on quite a bit of history, quite a bit of data, and more data we can collect if we accept that there is already enough to proceed on this wonderful integration. I'll just give you an example. Almost 3,000 years ago, Chinese already figured out that there is this two-level wave-particle distinction in their depiction of vital energy. Now, you don't get yin-yang or wave-particle. Well, actually, yang-in. Yang is the wave and yin is the particle. So that kind of duality you don't get except for quantum physics. That kind of depiction is a quantum depiction of the vital energies. So they clearly saw that their conceptualization of vital energy, which they call chi, has clearly a wave aspect and a particle aspect. Namely, they recognize the quantum nature of these chi objects 3,000 years ago. So, why are we having such difficulty today? It's just pure ego and inability to give value to what ancient people did. Now, I fortunately come from a tradition which is very open to the great wisdom of ancient people. I don't have the American arrogance. Forgive me for saying that. I am an American too, but I come from a different heritage. That helps me. But there is that arrogance of, Americans have it most of all countries, that we in the modern times know better. This arrogance prevents people from seeing wisdom in ancient thinking.
So how do you make that shift with people? How do you actually change people's perception of reality? It seems, like you say, it seems like everybody's looking outward for the answers, whether it's through science or through psychology, as opposed to, like you say, examining their own intuition and their own feelings, to go inward to find that. How do you actually change that paradigm? Because it seems like it's more and more we're drawn outside of ourselves through our electronic gadgetry, through the projection of our...
It's a difficult question. How you do it and what is effective, I don't know myself. I wish I knew. What I can do is only be true to myself. For me, it is important to live whatever I'm proposing, whatever I'm proposing to be true, that I have intuited and creatively explored. If I cannot live it, I don't sell it. If I live it, if it seems to be working for me, then only I become enthusiastic about it. So on that basis, it has to be very slow, because my progress, I must admit, some of these things that we are talking about are very, very difficult. I had no idea that to get emotional intelligence can be so tough. Not in the popular sense of Daniel Goleman's book. That sounds simple, but that's not what it's at. That's only the superficial level of it, the big talk. But actually doing it, taking the quantum leaps, where you indeed develop tangled hierarchical, what I call the circular two-way causal relationship with other people, and truly open a fountain of respect for other people. I can look at you and I can only respect you. This feeling that comes from inside me is not easy to generate. Okay?
So, in your moments of internal conflict, how soon do you notice it, and how do you notice it? Do you notice a contraction of your physical body? Do you notice a little snap of your mind? How quickly, and what do you do in those moments where you recognize that you've just suddenly taken a reactive turn?
Um, well, how I recognize it is just that a certain mellowing on my consciousness occurs. I'll give you an example. This is best done by examples. David Bohm had it. He talked about listening. So, when you don't have the capacity of listening, you don't understand what he's talking about. But when you do, you understand. All of a sudden, you start respecting David Bohm an enormous amount because there is a man who actually lived what he projected with his science. So we need more people of the kind who are dedicated to changing their way of life as a result of the integrating philosophy that we are developing. There is still too much tendency in the world of science to keep ourselves separate from what we do. But consciousness cannot be explored that way. Consciousness is very personal as well as objective. So unless you deal with the subjective aspects of consciousness and see that the objective ideas really has an effect on the subjective living, I think that your message is imperfect because you cannot live up to the values. This is why we find that spiritual people compete and scientists compete, whereas we talk about cooperation all the time. Why can't we cooperate with each other and see the value of each other's work and point out that, okay, this goes so far and this goes a little further and this goes a little further, and all this which would help the paradigm to shift enormous.
So in a personal sense, in your personal experience, in those moments of personal conflict, what do you do to right yourself, to balance?
Well, for me, what I find is that as I'm aware that I have tendencies of competitive competition, I immediately realize, okay, so this is where I have to work at it. And so I work at it. And as I work at it, at understanding the differences, I become mellow. I become accepting and tolerant because I know exactly what the author is trying to say and how far it goes and where the author is in some sense, not entirely. When I meet the person, it's easier. From the writing, I can't always discern where the author is coming from entirely. But still, I have noticed that if something, you depend on your intuition, if something is important, you sort of intuit that this should be followed up, and then I do. And as you follow it up, you listen, and that listening produces a softening, and that softening makes you recognize, okay, so where in your work does this work fit in? And it fits in. This is the surprising thing. Even scientific materialists who are doing work, their scientific exploration seriously, not a demagogue like, I'll mention names, I'm already mentioning names, like Richard Dawkins or Stephen Hawking, not those demagogues, because they say things for popular consumption. Stephen Hawking has no interest in God's mind in the sense that people, religious or spiritual people, mean God's mind, but he uses the term just to be popular, so that doesn't count. But there are other materialist scientists who are sincere in what they're saying. And if you listen, then you see the validity of the approach they have taken. And this is very important because then only you can integrate. If you start seeing the best of people instead of seeing the worst of people, then only this tendency that we automatically have, this competitive tendency, gives way to cooperation because you find that you can learn and there is no end to how much you can learn. There are so many aspects of consciousness. It's really a very vast field and it accommodates a lot of different things, a lot of conflicting things sometimes, where integration requires that we develop the attitude of taking quantum leaps of synthesis.
It seems I talk to a lot of older people who have a very strong sense of our innate pathway to consciousness, and younger people. And it seems like there's a bit of a shift. The older generation seem to feel that conflict is a definite way of promoting consciousness, and the newer generation seem to think that we don't need to go through such conflict to achieve a certain sense of equilibrium in the world. What's your feelings on that?
Well, conflicts are very important because conflicts produce this, almost definitely produce new possibilities for consciousness to choose from. These new possibilities, if you don't try to resolve all the conflicts at the conscious level, you try as far as possible, but you are always open that, okay, I'm not understanding it. This conflict I cannot resolve on the basis of what I know, so let it be. That let it be puts it into the unconscious for processing. And the unconscious, of course, has much more creative power because it's the power of whole consciousness that does the processing. And therefore, when such opposing ideas, conflicts, thesis, antithesis, if you will, create new possibilities, your expanded consciousness that exists in the unconscious that sees the new possibilities and the possibility of integration. So your chance of creating a chance of having a quantum leap goes up very much, and so that's what I do, and that makes a huge amount of difference. That's what I mean by tolerance. As you tolerate, you allow unconscious to work for you. This is the spiritual, actually, quantum physics is rediscovering the spiritual technique. This is the spiritual technique of conflict resolution. Conflict resolution cannot be done in a hurried manner. Conflict resolution has to wait for step by step initially, but then has to allow unconscious processing, and then quantum leap, and then you manifest, then you discuss, then you do diplomacy. Notice how different this is from the kind of conflict resolution that is taught in Harvard, because that's scientific materialism based, everything at the conscious level. That leads to some progress, of course. It's not true that that leads nowhere, but it will reach only a limited version of the resolution. This is why we don't have real conflict resolutions in the world usually.
So that kind of brings us to another aspect here, which is the concept of free will. Like, in other words, how in control are we of our actual responses and emotions? There's some people suggest that we have to use the power of intention, and some people suggest that we have to acquiesce to that great force, and that something else takes over that isn't part of our decision-making process. What does quantum physics suggest? Does this suggest that we manipulate or we are manipulated?
Well, our freedom is our freedom. But we have to recognize that who are we? So at one level we are ego, and that's what we experience most often, that's where we are most often, and therefore we should be very tolerant of our ego. That, okay, all I can do is begin at the ego level because that's where I can begin. That's what is accessible moment to moment, more or less. Yeah. So we begin there. We begin an intention at the ego level. But then the traditions are also right. We have to let go because, as I said, it's the unconscious which has the greater power of processing, not I and the limited ego who can only process the known. I cannot process the unknown. So how do I make room for the unknown? That's where I have to let go. So the process in creativity, I call it do. We do alternative focusing to maintain focus on the conflict or focus on the intention, and then I let go. That's the be. When I relax, like in spiritual traditions, the saying is, the train is already moving, put your luggage down. So we just put our luggage down, let the unconscious do it. This process, do is what I call quantum thinking. If we bring quantum thinking into the process, then freedom of will becomes very much of a reality. And this two-level processing produces those insights that we call creative insights. Aha. It comes with a surprise, suggesting discontinuity, suggesting that I somehow have discovered something that is new, that is now adding to my ego's repertoire of knowledge. So this is really the use of freedom. Otherwise, the commonplace meaning of freedom is really what I call ice cream consciousness. What flavor of ice cream would you like? That kind of freedom. Yes, we do have that freedom, and that freedom is important, of course. But much more important is this creative freedom. So first of all, you have to develop a attitude in the society itself that, we talk about freedom all the time, but we really don't even know what freedom means. Freedom is freedom from the known, as the mystic Jiddu Krishnamurti used to say. That's the ultimate freedom. There is no freedom in the known. Freedom in the known is just followers' freedom. That how do you become a leader in your own thinking? How do you become an original? If psychology shifted to the idea of really defining what is freedom and what makes us a human being, Carl Rogers came to the closest. He defined the word person on becoming a person. You become a person by being creative. He recognized it. But the rest of psychologists don't even recognize Carl Rogers so very much.
So how does purpose fit into this? Because purpose, do you have a sense of purpose? Do you think there is a purpose for humanity?
Of course, yes. The purpose comes from your capacity or your sensitivity to recognize the purpose of the universe. This sensitivity is something that creativity researchers talk about, but not too many other people talk about. They get lost into other things being the goal of life. And yes, those other things like discovering wholeness or discovering God, these things are emphasized a lot in the spiritual traditions. And what they do is kind of putting the horse before the cart. They putting the cart before the horse. The thing is that you have to go first recognize the sensitivity, the purpose of whatever it is that goes on. Without that sensitivity, one never tuned in with the consciousness as a whole, with the universe. So this kind of thing is lacks even in spiritual traditions, let alone in the psychology tradition. People just haven't studied the subject of creativity very much. This is what I, in my most recent book, when I was writing it, this is what I discovered, that creativity researchers, on the other hand, they have been talking about how important it is to recognize the purpose of the universe, how important it is to tune in. And those people who become an Einstein or Picasso or the great scientists, great artists, great musicians, they were all tuned in. And today, the number of people who are tuned in is just so small. Of course, I haven't met every one of the great humanity researchers, but I have met a substantial amount. It's amazing. People can be very good in what they do, but still have so little tuning in with the universal purposiveness, because this is just not emphasized, neither in spiritual tradition nor in the scientific.
And I suppose creativity could even manifest itself through a being, not necessarily through an ability or a perspective.
That's the point. That's the point, and that's the point that misses. Now, the great creatives were working on their being anyway. But what happened to the ordinary creative is that we get lost with the product that is often an outer product. So we become famous, we make a little money, and those things take over our life, perhaps. Of course, money and fame are not motivations for any creative person. That I will say, because, their creativity is motivated correctly, namely that it is a search for meaning, it is a search for an archetype value, certainly. But it is often the purposiveness is still vague. It's certainly not as tuned as it could be if they were aware that such a tuning could indeed would make a difference in their creativity.
Right. One of the most powerful statements that I'd read that really kind of was spelled something out for me was something I read from Gurdjieff, and he had said that at one time singing and dance was a way to move your awareness, not an expression of the self that it's become in modern times. And it seems like everything has become an expression of the self, my angst, my joy, my this and that. I don't know if you agree with that or not, whereas in the old times, dancing was a way of altering your consciousness, or singing, chanting was a way of altering your consciousness. It was an expression of the self. Now, was it important that humanity goes through this ego sophistication to hone and fine tune our awareness? And is it all part of our evolution?
Well, I think that you have to find a place in the evolution for scientific materialism. I do think that perhaps, because all is movement of consciousness, I have no doubt about that. And then I sometimes wonder, where are we going through this very distortive phase of scientific materialism becoming a polarizing influence on our culture? The culture was doing fine under modernism. And eventually quantum integration would have taken place. If all of a sudden, the intellectual shift from Europe to America, where people are practical, World War II did that, and it's nobody's fault. America was just not philosophical enough to grasp quantum physics in the 1950s, and therefore practical problems. And then Sputnik came along, and the Cold War did not help. Weapons making got defocused from scientists. So all kinds of reasons develop, practical reasons, for avoiding the philosophical questions. So is this part of the purposiveness of consciousness? I think that it could be, of course, but I think a better explanation is that maybe scientific materialism, that vein that has always existed, we always had scientific materialist among us, just not so blatantly as it is today, and not as a competing worldview. But Democritus's idea that started scientific materialism is also very old as Plato's ideas. So we have to recognize the power of that kind of thinking. And so maybe what is happening is that we just need to get this out of our system by looking at what happens if scientific materialism gets a dominance in the culture, in the society. What happens is what is happening now. You cannot operate anything. Even capitalism, which is a perfectly sensible way of doing things under the modernist, where you value values, how that completely becomes inoperable in a scientific materialist dominant society, because people become so selfish they forget about social good completely. So what has to be then understood is that by only looking at the follies of such a philosophy, that it is really one-sided and it really isn't this way. Reality needs both. It needs consciousness and matter. So that recognition we already have seen the failure of the religious dogma. That doesn't work by itself either. Now we are seeing the failure of the materialist dogma by itself. That doesn't work either. So what works is a system that puts the two together. Namely, we need values for our advancement of civilization, but we also need material prosperity to have enough means, the middle class, to look for spare time and have the incentive to look for values, exploration of values. So both systems, neglecting the material side doesn't help, neglecting the spiritual side doesn't help. A combination, which is what quantum worldview is about, is essential.
So what should that core value be?
Well, the core value, of course, is consciousness and knowing who you are. That's a core value, no question, self. But self in a very broad sense. Who you are, if you look at it honestly, you discover that no, this narcissistic self certainly isn't it. And that's too narrow. On that basis, there is nothing but I. Not even a room for relationship. And human being, you very quickly recognize, cannot live without relationship, however much people try. But human beings are not robots. The things that our kids are missing, but the kids become very different later age. The kids who are delving into hyperactivity and all this information processing kind of thing, they get tired of all that stuff pretty quickly. Those who are not carried away by their success in terms of making money, they become tired even more quickly than those who encounter success. Success is a huge difficulty for some people to recognize the limitations of their thinking. But many of the kids are recognizing already. So already, what produced that Wall Street, that kind of movement? What produced it is the dissatisfaction many kids are feeling with the kind of society that we're going towards.
Do people just need options to choose from, or is it something that has to change at our base? I mean, it seems the people that can integrate the concepts, the philosophies that you're talking about are a small minority of the population. Um, that may have always been the case. It's always a small percentage. How does that percentage grow?
Well, that's what where this new insights that we are gaining from science becomes very important. For example, look at information processing. How did that become so important and replacing meaning processing so fast today? Because we had to explore it. We had to explore it because scientific materialism says that there is not any meaning to meaning. You know, they have been selling this idea for quite some time. Initially, it was like a joke. I remember people quoted Steven Weinberg and just said something that, oh, okay, scientific materialism, it's decrying, it's denigrating meaning, because he said something, the more we look at the universe, the more it seems meaningless, pointless. So, but it seems like anything that kind of attitude could be easily denied, and that kind of attitude can be easily objected to, and that's the way it is. But it's not the way it is. What it is a part of a movement towards obliterating meaning, because the worldview of scientific materialism really does not permit any emphasis on meaning. It permits only information. So gradually, these very intelligent people are developing a worldview where information replaces meaning. So what do we have for kids now? Only information processing. It started in the 1980s. You remember those days where all of a sudden we started thinking, oh, these laptop computers, they're great because they're enabling us, ordinary people, to process things that require all this sophistication and all these laboratories to go to, all these skirts to carry, and all of a sudden a housewife could do it. But the point is, housewife didn't do it. Who did it are the kids who played video games, right. And very slowly the idea was introduced that information processing is enough. And then the college and school educations were modified. Very tricky, very slow, and very unobtrusive. Even the religious girls of scientific materialism, even they did not notice how the whole entire education in schools changed from meaning processing to information processing. I noticed it because all of a sudden, my daughter and son, they're bringing huge amounts of homework at home. It is no longer read a book, right, and give it a time. No, it's now 5 books. It's now 10 books. Right. It's 105 books in an entire quarter that they're supposed to read. How do you read 105 books and get any meaning out of it? Of course you don't. You just get the information. This was written by this and this author. You get a synopsis from the internet, and that's it. So in this way, gradually, meaning processing was replaced by information processing. But now that we're noticing what it does to the brain, hyperactivity, this is where I bow to the scientific materialist. There will be enough honest explorers, enough honest researchers who will find out the opposite effect of the harming effect of anything as well. This is how we find out defects of a particular pharmaceutical. This is the same way that we found out what happens if a kid processes information. It becomes hyperactive. So now, gradually, the recognition is coming that information actually is toxic to the brain. Brain is made for processing meaning, not processing information. As this kind of idea gets into the society, and we will revise the education curriculum, especially in elementary schools, especially preschool, because the information processor have taken the education of kids to the preschool level, where so much information is already put into the child's brain that it becomes so hyperactive that the child forever cannot read. I meet people all the time who have degrees, college degrees, but cannot read, How can you process meaning? This is why books don't sell. It's not that people don't want meaning. It's just that they cannot read. So how can they read books?
Right. Can you describe and summarize what you mean by quantum activism?
Quantum activism is the idea that, well, if you learn the quantum worldview, you get certain quantum principles. For example, the wave particle duality that I mentioned earlier, that's a quantum principle. So all objects have a potentiality and then actuality. The actuality part is the part that we know, but objects have potentiality beyond it, beyond that actuality. Potentiality, for example, even at the level of an electron, I observe an electron at a point. If I'm a Newtonian scientist, I'll just conclude that, okay, the electrons appear in this particular experiment, the electrons appear here. But if I'm open, I do another experiment, I find no, the electron can also appear somewhere else. So I have the concept of wave of possibility, that electrons actually are possibility waves which can be at more than one place at the same time in the domain of potentiality. In the domain of actuality, they become just one thing. So we should not lose sight of the wave aspect, the potentiality aspect, just by seeing that they appear to be things in a single experiment. Now generalize this to our thoughts, to our feelings, to our intuitions. As soon as we recognize that one particular investigation, one particular recognition is not it, that's not the whole story. There is potentiality beyond this. This is the kind of thing that you learn to incorporate in your life. We're talking about openness, tolerance before, we're talking about unconscious processing before. You become aware that there's a vast amount of potentiality in the unconscious, that studying the known does not even give us an inkling of what that is about. So your whole focus of life becomes, instead of being oriented towards the known, becomes oriented towards unknown, which has to be then investigated with creativity. So that's basically the objective of quantum activists, how to use these quantum principles and non-locality, discontinuity, tangled hierarchical relationships. These are also very basic principles, along with that wave particle duality and importance of consciousness. When we do that, our life, the focus of our life, changes. One change is what I talked about earlier. You become tuned to the movement of consciousness as a whole. You are no longer feeling separate from the universe. You're part of it. John Wheeler used to talk about participatory universe. You become a participant of the movement of consciousness in the universe. So that's a very big thing, because that saves you from isolation. You're no longer a narcissist. You cannot be a narcissist in quantum activism. So, and other ways of change that take place, of course, is that you become tolerant, you become patient, you are more situated in yourself, and your internal landscape, that deep ecological aspect of ourselves that Arne Ness so powerfully talked about in his philosophy of deep ecology, you become sensitive to your inner environment. You want to clean it up. So as your inner environment cleans up, your tendency will be to also clean up the outer environment. And that's how some of the ecological problems that we are facing, that will be the paramount problems that we have to solve, they will be solved. Because when the inner landscape is clean, we'll want to make the outer landscape clean also. But the opposite way that we have now, try to clean up the outer environment without cleaning the inner, obviously is not working, because we cannot do it. Cleaning the outer environment requires certain sacrifices. We cannot make those sacrifices. We cannot reduce the standard of living without cleaning up the inner landscape, without transforming ourselves, without being aware that we are connected. Our destruction of the environment is harming everybody. So, that kind of holistic approach. So it's a holistic approach to living that is quantum activism is about.
Does quantum physics suggest that there is a universal intelligence?
Yes, that intelligence is what I call consciousness. You can call it a universal intelligence if you like. But you have to be careful about using the word intelligence, because many people have many different connotations of it. Of course, every word, unfortunately, has connotations. Consciousness, I think, is probably the most general word for this ground of being.
And what is a human relationship to that consciousness, in your opinion?
Well, it's not just my opinion, it's what quantum physics tells us.
Right.
Quantum physics tells us that this consciousness is the ground of being, and the only way to understand our connection of the individuality, how that relates to this cosmic being, is that we become conditioned. This cosmic being manifests in us in an unconditioned aspect of the self, which reveals itself in creative experiences or spiritual experiences, experiences of intuition even. If we take that hint and proceed further, then we can discover this holistic nature of our self, that the self is not just individual, just this conditioned self, but self is deeper. It is actually the whole enchilada, whole universe, whole reality. And that is what is the lesson of quantum physics. So quantum physics in this sense is highly spiritual. It's a physics of consciousness. It really implicitly saying that, look, consciousness is the ground of being. Otherwise, you can never understand quantum physics.
And if you were talking to somebody that's just starting their path to becoming aware of their selves, at whatever level that they are in or stage they are in of their awareness, what would you suggest to them as a method of becoming more aware of themselves, of their behavior and of their responses and of their inner workings?
Well, we are also very, very clear in the quantum activism movement that it depends. The point is that the majority of people have, because of a variety of reasons, have difficulties. The level of awareness is just not there to get into high-level changes in the way that they experience the world. So it is very important to go into psychology a little bit and discover with them one of the most important discoveries of recent times, of course, is that there really are levels of awareness in people. Some people just, psychopaths and sociopaths just don't even have any tolerance for any psychological maturity. For them to talk to them about worldview integration and all this is quite meaningless, or creativity is quite meaningless. Does that mean that they don't have intelligence? No, they have basic cognitive abilities and stuff. Some of them indeed do, as you know. But that's not the issue. The issue is that the nobler sentiments, they come with a certain psychological maturity. So taking the psychological view, the lowest levels of awareness like psychopathology, those have to be excluded. You cannot expect them to go very much anywhere. And then the problem of, okay, you have psychologically normal people, and what then? Well, there the question of upbringing comes in, culture comes in, opportunity comes in. This is where questions of economics comes in. The recent widening gap between rich and poor, which shrinks the middle class, that doesn't help. Middle class is very essential. That wanting to be mobile in society, that American dream, is a very essential component of creativity. That may sound very crude, but that's because we have made American dream very crude, only in terms of material prosperity. But that's not what it's at. It's changing the level, the station of my being also. It's a station of being satisfied with life. It's a more of a dream to become from psychopathology to more balanced human being. That's the real American dream, not moving up just the levels of social prosperity, right, from poor to middle class to rich. That's just an economic way of describing something which goes much deeper. In the psychological sense, it's going from pathology to normal to positive. That's a much deeper American dream. So if you look at the American dream in this way, then I think you get more clear about why there are so very few people. Because there are so very few people, who have the economic opportunity as well as the preparation, that ability, enough slowness, the culture has permitted that somehow, that kind of thing to be created. So my estimate is right now we can probably cannot hope very much beyond a few percent of people, but at the same time, I must say that I take heart from this idea, which is very old. Spiritual tradition started it, but Rupert Sheldrake gave it some voice, and I do too, which is that the idea that even a few people can change the world. Because if we do that, there is a mechanism in biological evolution called Lamarckism, which we now have revived in terms of quantum physics and morphogenetic fields, which suggests that if we make changes in our brain in terms of developing new capacities like loving somebody, then those capacities, those brain circuits, the capacity to build those brain circuits will be stored in a non-local way outside of space and time. Then people in the future might be able to inherit them without even going through all the rigor of making them in their own brain. And the idea is that's how we got our collective unconscious that Jung discovered. That's how we got our instincts that have been well known for quite some time. So if you believe in this idea, then you become optimistic.
Yeah, I've had a few people suggest to me that those, it doesn't take over 50%. It just takes the mass of a core bunch of people, that their mass can outweigh the mass, the energetic mass of the whole, and shift everything. I'm hoping for that too. So in the context of everything we've talked about, what for you then is the most pressing issue right now for the individual and for the species?
Well, I think for the individual and the species, the first issue probably is to develop the worldview integration, the understanding the implication of quantum. It's such a shame because, quantum physics was discovered in 1925-26. That's almost 100 years. From Copernicus to Galileo was about 100 years. If they could do it that time, which was so undeveloped and so forth, and today we have such developed technology, internet, cell phone, all these things certainly have improved our communication. You and I are communicating free through Skype. Well, not entirely free, but it's fairly free, and it's wonderful because I can see you, you can see me, we can feed each other's energy that way better. So if such communication, why are we taking so long to decide these issues? Because these things that we talked about earlier, of course, they are producing abstractions to this integration. So it's very important for everyone who is aware that polarization is not only stopping the government to operate, polarization is not only producing this huge income gap that is destroying our middle class, but the biggest effect of polarization that we have is that every social system that we have built under modernism, when both mind and matter were valued, that 300-year period in our history was the period of maximum rapid evolution of our society, of civilization. Why was that? Because we valued both matter and mind. Quantum physics now enables us to develop a system in which both matter and mind are valued equally. If they are valued, if we have this integration, then very quickly we can go into a society which will revive all the powers of capitalism, all the powers of democracy, liberal education and all that, and we'll be able to solve our problems rather quickly. So it may sound a bit simplistic, putting worldview at such a positive level where very few people even understand what a worldview is about. But I think that philosophy sometimes really have to be focused by at least those people who understand it, because then what matters is that the movers and shakers. These are the people who will make up the curriculum which go into the elementary school and educate our children and produce the dogmatic behavior or not. So how they come out of this dogmatic behavior is again produce this kind of mindset among the movers and shakers that will have a very quick effect. Government intervention may be necessary at this level, but all this has to be sort of synchronistic too, because of course today it's very polarized. You know, if the democratic government, then they become scientific materialist. If it's Republican, it becomes religion. So how do we get quantum into the arena of politics? These are huge challenges, and don't expect me to give all the answers. I have some ideas, but I think that maybe an economic approach may bring some changes most quickly. Obviously, education sounds like the best approach, but how do you educate, and how does Amit Goswami have the audacity to say to a Harvard man that I know more than you? You know, society gives the Harvard man the privilege of being the most influential in our education. So these are difficulties.
So you're a very eloquent fellow, and if this was a public service message to the world, right now you were speaking to the planet, to all of humanity, what would you say?
Well, I think I already did. I mean, this is the thing, Randall. I really think that it is not far-fetched to bring the idea that, look, if we integrate this polarization of worldviews, not only will the political polarization go away between, all this do-nothing Congress, all those things will go away, but the stagnation we are finding in economics goes away. Our ability to handle the ecosystem comes back because we are emphasizing both inner ecology and outer ecology. And, with that, problems of terrorism, etc., all things that also tend to become minimized. We come back to talking about human beings once more in the society rather than machines. And we have dealt with, of course, some big health issues that are coming up because of the dominance of scientific materialism. So health becomes more holistic and tractable. So when people see, I wrote a book called How Quantum Activism Can Save Civilization. And, such a title may seem presumptuous, but I'm quite serious, although the title actually, to be frank, was chosen by, not me, but by the publisher, a fellow named Greg Vandenberg, actually, who chose it. That beautiful title, I supported it because it is quite serious that you have to use quantum physics to make the integration, and this integration is essential to save our very civilization. Now, of course, I'm very willing to admit that not all people have the intellectual patience of understanding quantum physics, but as I said, not all people need to understand quantum physics. What the people that need to understand quantum physics are the movers and shakers, the shapers of our school curriculum. That's the most important thing. Politicians, perhaps, because government has to intervene in the initial stages. And, this is what I would say.
Thank you very much for your time and your eloquence and your brilliant mind to share with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
You too.
Thank you.